After flying with the Royal Naval Air Service in the First World War, Errol Boyd established record-setting flights, and in 1930 he was the first Canadian to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. Throughout his life in Canada and the United States, Errol promoted wide interest in aviation and its possibilities. Born in Toronto on November 22, 1891, Errol Boyd was the youngest of his parents' three children. In 1912, a famed American aviator, Lincoln Beechey, gave Errol his first flight in an experience that had life-changing consequences for Errol. In 1913, Errol enlisted to serve in the First World War with the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, then was given leave to join the Royal Naval Air Service in Great Britain. At the East Church Station of the Royal Naval Air Service in England, as a probationary flight sub-lieutenant, Errol learned to fly in 1915, where his first solo flight was made using a Short Brothers biplane. His instructor at East Church was Captain John Alcock, who with Arthur Brown made the first transatlantic flight, leaving from St. John's, Newfoundland in June 1919, flying a Vickers Vimy bomber of the First World War, a flight that Errol Boyd would make 11 years later. In September 1915, Errol was posted to Dunkirk, where operational flights included stalking Zeppelins and attacking submarines. But on October 3, while flying an REP Parasol aircraft, he was hit by anti-aircraft fire at 12,000 feet, then made a forced landing in neutral Holland, where he was taken by Dutch soldiers. The next day, his parents were notified by two telegrams, first that Errol was missing, and then interned in Holland. On the promise he would not escape, Lieutenant Boyd was twice granted permission to return to Canada and the United States for visiting. On leave from internment, in July 1917, Errol married Evelyn Carberry, whom he had first met in Toronto in 1914. The couple eventually became the parents of 5 daughters. After the war, success of his musical compositions prompted Errol to move to New York, flying when he could and seeking a sponsor for a transatlantic flight. In 1928, he accepted a position with Pan American World Airways to fly in Mexico, gaining experience there with Pan American Airways and Mexicana Airlines. When the Boyds returned to New York in 1929, Errol continued his quest to fly across the Atlantic, making arrangements to use an aircraft named Columbia, a Wright-Bellanca WB-2, a prototype built by the Wright Aeronautical Corporation in 1925 and owned by Charles Levine, who was Boyd's employer. In May 1930, Errol teamed up with famed American pilot Roger Williams and with Harry Connor, who was a navigator with the U.S. Navy. On June 29, 1930, they flew Columbia from Roosevelt Field, New York, circled Bermuda, and returned, a flight of 17 hours. Boyd was then able to take possession of the Columbia in Montreal. After securing some financial backing for a transatlantic flight, he rechristened the aircraft as Maple Leaf. With Harry Connor as navigator, Boyd flew the Maple Leaf to Harbour Grace, Newfoundland in September 1930. On October 9, fully loaded with 460 gallons of fuel and carrying some 300 letters for the first airmail from Canada, Maple Leaf lifted off from the Harbour Grace grass airstrip. Due to a clogged fuel line and having to jettison 100 gallons of fuel to minimize risk in a forced landing, Boyd and Connor came down on the narrow beach of Tresco, second largest of the Isles of Scilly, stopping at water's edge with empty tanks. After landing at Tresco, the next day the aviators flew to Croydon, England, the original intended destination. And there to meet Errol Boyd and Harry Connor as the celebrations began was Charles Levine, owner of the aircraft. On October 30, Boyd and Connor flew Maple Leaf to Amsterdam, Berlin, and Paris, and were celebrated in all 3 cities. Errol Boyd was the first Canadian to fly across the Atlantic, a flight that was big news at the time. He was celebrated upon his return to Toronto and recognized internationally as he flew into the pages of history, having departed from the Harbour Grace airfield in Newfoundland. In 1933, Captain Boyd flew the Columbia to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, on a return flight from Washington, D.C. The following year, the famous aircraft was destroyed in a fire. In 1938, as the aviation editor of the Toronto Star, Errol raised public awareness of aviation through his regular column called Wings Over Toronto. He formed the non-profit Aviation Scouts of Canada to inspire young people, an organization that became the forerunner of the Royal Canadian Air Cadets. During the Second World War, he was taken on as executive officer of the Clayton Knight Committee, named for the artist and author, encouraging Americans to enlist in the RAF or the RCAF. With a life spent promoting aviation, by 1957, Errol had logged over 9,000 hours as a pilot. He retired in Florida with Evelyn and died at the family vacation home in Connecticut at the age of 69 on November 27, 1960. Errol Boyd was inducted as a member of Canada's Aviation Hall of Fame on June 15, 2017.